We're really honored to talk about a very important and critical issue right now in terms of combating racial animus against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. That sort of xenophobia and bigotry is on the rise across the country, here in Seattle, and of course everyone is aware of the tragic shootings in Atlanta in March. This is a really important, critical issue for so many members of our community, and looking at why it happened, what were the stepping stones that led us there, how we could influence those, and what we could do to change this is really important. We're honored to have three fantastic panelists with us tonight to talk about this issue. Governor Gary Locke, as the governor of Washington State, was the first Chinese American to be elected governor in the United States, and also has served as U.S. Secretary of Commerce and U.S. Ambassador to China. Currently, he serves as the interim president of Bellevue College, which is the third largest higher education institution in the state of Washington. His innovations in government have won him acclaim from nationally recognized authors and organizations, including Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. In his 2 terms as governor, Washington was ranked as one of America's 4 best managed states. I'd also like to welcome Chief Adrian Diaz. Chief Diaz has been a member of the Seattle Police Department for more than 2 decades. His work building relationships that bridge race, ethnicity, and every flavor of humanity can be seen across the department and across the city of Seattle. He began his career in patrol, served on the mountain bike unit and the anti-crime team before joining Investigations Bureau. He served as assistant chief of a collaborative policing bureau prior to being promoted to deputy chief, and is now serving as the interim chief. He holds a BA in criminal justice from Central Washington and a master's in public administration from the University of Washington. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Lisa Chin. Dr. Chin joined Treehouse as CEO in April 2020. She's a visionary strategist and fundraiser who has more than 20 years of experience in senior executive leadership with a proven ability to scale mission-focused organizations. She's spent her career focused on young people, education, and equity-based systems change, providing opportunities to those who need it most. Prior to serving at Treehouse, she was the founding executive director at Year Up Puget Sound and the CEO of Boys and Girls Club of King County. She holds a doctorate in education from UCLA and a bachelor's degree in political science and art from Wellesley College. Our interviewers tonight are Dr. Larry Hubbell, Joni Balter, and Dr. Yutan Lee. Dr. Larry Hubbell is a professor and immediate past director of our Institute of Public Service, which houses our own Masters of Public Administration program here at Seattle U. And prior to his tenure at Seattle U, he was a professor at the University of Wyoming. He also worked for 10 years in the federal government at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and has done Fulbright scholarships literally all over the world. Joni Balter is a multimedia journalist and lecturer who hosts Civic Cocktail, sponsored by the Seattle City Club and the Seattle Channel. She's also a regular affiliate on NPR KUOW's Week in Review and provides political analysis on Friday mornings, as well as contributing to Bloomberg. She is joining us at Seattle U as the professional in residence in the Institute of Public Service at Seattle U, and we're very happy to have her. She also teaches at University of Washington, the other university here in Seattle. Finally, I want to introduce Dr. Yutan Lee, who is the chair of the Political Science Department and the director of the Asian Studies program at Seattle University. He will be leading the student question portion of our event with 2 of our students who we're very happy to have here, Jeffrey Cook and Matthew Condi. With that, I want to thank you all for being here and turn it over to Dr. Larry Hubbell. Welcome everyone once again, and Dr. Hubbell.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure that being here tonight and doing this very important topic. We are going to be breaking this into basically 2 sections. The first 45 minutes, Joni and I will be asking questions of the 3 panelists. And we'll also try to work in some of the questions from the audience. And then the last 15 minutes or so will be devoted to questions from 2 of our students in the Asian Studies program, and also Dr. Yutan Lee. So without further ado, Joni, could you start, please?
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. So good to see you all here on the Town Hall magic screen. Chief Diaz, we thought we'd start with you. I think we first need to get our arms around the problem. So the question to you is, how bad are the incidents or attacks on Asian American and Pacific Islander people in our community? What does the data tell us? in that regard?
Yeah, so, when we've been tracking, bias crimes and bias instances and hate crimes for a number of years. We actually have a public dashboard highlighting all of the events that has occurred probably over the last 10 years. This year specifically, in 2020, we saw almost 2 instances a day. And it rose up to about 750 plus instances related to bias crimes, hate crimes, and bias incidences that might not necessarily rise to a crime. So we have different measures, but I don't think that hate didn't exist prior to it. It already existed. I mean, we know over the last 245 years, this country has been in existence. We've had hate throughout our communities, throughout everything. I think in relation to COVID, it really brought up a lot of emotions because now we're seeing a lot more things that are occurring in the community than we've ever seen. And I think people are reporting it because they're wanting to make sure that they highlight all the incidences that are going on. So I don't want to say that hate crime just started to rise this year. I think it's already been in existence in our communities. It's just really coming out this year.
But Chief Diaz, you're saying there is a sort of a pandemic, we're trapped in our houses kind of theme to this in a way.
I think I think there's one component. We've seen a variety of crimes rise this year. And I think we're educating ourselves more. I think as a community, we found ourselves learning and understanding about hate and being able to take a stand against it. And this really started, it started right during the COVID pandemic, and I think we had an election or had a president that kind of fueled that. And then we found ourselves in the George Floyd murder, and that fueled a whole nother set of hate crimes and hate incidences and race issues. And I think we're now starting to really, as a country, start to have more dialogue and discussion about how our country operates.
So Dr. Chin, why do you think Asian American and Pacific Islander women bear the brunt of this awful trend?
Oh, Joni, I wish you didn't have to ask that question, but it's a very valid question. Of the nearly 3,800 incidents of violence that have been reported to stop AAPI hate over the first year of this pandemic, 68% of those were aimed at women. And I believe that that's because Asian American women for the longest time have existed at the intersection of racism and sexism. I mean, it's no secret. If you look back over the media history of how Asian women have been portrayed since there was media and television, radio in this country, there's been the fetishization of Asian women has been well documented. And so Asian women are seen as victims, as passive, as meek, or as hypersexualized, and therefore targets that are not human, that are not seen as respectable or worthy. And as Chief Diaz has pointed out, our 45th president highlighted issues during this pandemic, naming things like the Kung flu and telling people it was the China virus. And so that exacerbated the hatred and the racial incidents that have existed since there have been Asian people coming to and being in America.
Governor Locke, you're very knowledgeable about anti-Asian policies, the history of anti-Asian policies, and also anti-Asian laws. I wonder if you could tell our audience a little bit about that.
Mike. Wait.
Oh, all right. As Chief Diaz and Dr. Chin have already remarked, our nation's history is filled with episodes of racism, systemic racism, and one could argue that our economic political system was built on discrimination and racism, whether it's the enslavement of African Americans and treating African Americans as less than whole individuals, starting with the first census under George Washington, But clearly, racism against Asian Americans, and specifically Chinese Americans, goes back to the 1880s. The very first immigration policy of the United States was targeted at excluding Chinese. You had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which really banned laborers from China coming over. And this is right after the Chinese were brought to the United States on behalf of the US government and the railroads to finish the Transcontinental Railroad, which was stuck outside the mountains of California. And then many of them stayed here to work in the gold mines, the lumber camps, and serving as, doing menial labor. And at a time in which jobs were scarce, that created a backlash. Then you go into the early, and by the way, that Exclusion Act, barring immigration from China to the United States, existed until mid-1940s, up until the middle of World War II. Even though you had so many Chinese American soldiers fighting on behalf of the United States during World War II, nonetheless, so many of them were not allowed to actually come into the United States. And then in the early 1900s, you actually had policies that were passed by many states, primarily on the West Coast, much of it fueled and originating here from the state of Washington, prohibiting foreigners, primarily Asians, Japanese, and Chinese individuals from owning land. And those laws were not repealed until the early 1950s. And then, of course, you have all the acts of violence that have occurred since then. And as Chief Diaz indicated, it did not help that we had a president, the last president, who started talking about people from Mexico or having a Muslim ban, saying people from, SH expletive countries in Africa, and then targeting the people of China, the so-called S-hole countries. So you have this rhetoric now that perpetuates the notion that Asian Americans and Chinese Americans are foreigners. They are perpetual foreigners. They are somehow more loyal to the countries and the governments of their ancestors than they are to the US government. And then you have the Kung Flu virus, the China virus, et cetera, et cetera. But you have policies under the Trump administration that almost restricted Chinese students from coming into the United States on the grounds that they're all spies. You have investigations against professors at our colleges, universities, professors of Chinese ancestry, even though they're born in the United States, US citizens, and somehow they're all spies, and failing to report getting even honorariums or honorary degrees from China, or doing things in partnership at the request and the knowledge and the consent of their American universities, doing partnerships, engaging in partnerships with Chinese universities. And then, of course, attacks against Chinese tech companies or even US tech companies founded by people of Chinese ancestries, that somehow all of this is a pretense for spying and espionage and affecting the security of our country. And so you basically, as Dr. Chin said, women are looked at as victims, as less than whole individuals, and so they become easy targets, and especially the elderly. So we have really this history of racism and discrimination, profiling, scapegoating, and characterization of Chinese Americans, Asian Americans as foreigners, and that makes it easier to go after them.
Joni, I think you have a follow-up question to Governor Locke.
Well, yeah, on that point, Governor, you were the first Chinese American governor, as we've all said. I remember at the time of the campaign that you didn't talk much about race or racism. And an interesting fact, and you and I have talked about this before, in fact, at roughly the same time, Norm Rice, African American, was the mayor of Seattle. Ron Sims, African American, King County executive. And I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that at the time, race was largely either a positive in these campaigns as they were run, or it wasn't mentioned at all. So I'm wondering, has racism increased, or are we just more willing to talk about it right now?
Well, I think racism and division has increased in this country over the last several years. It's kind of brought out the rhetoric of our previous president Trump has really brought out the dark divisions and some of the latent profiling, discriminatory feelings within so many Americans. I mean, I think a lot of people felt that when Barack Obama was elected president, we had somehow turned a huge corner. And yet we look at all the division that's existed in this country, fueled by the rhetoric of President Trump, starting with accusing Mexican Americans as being racist and drug dealers and criminals, to the S-hole countries of Africa, to the Muslim ban, and then, of course, to the rhetoric against Asian Americans and Chinese Americans. So I think he's made it fashionable and really has stoked this division, especially at a time in which people were, worried about their jobs and are out of work. And so it's easy always to find blame with other people. And Asian Americans have become a very easy target. Just in our Seattle area, as Chief Diaz pointed out, we've had a huge increase in acts of violence against Asian Americans. And those are just reported. And of course, many of the perpetrators are never caught. But for those who are caught and are prosecuted, the King County Prosecutor's Office has stated that the number of prosecutions involving hate crimes targeting Asian Americans has gone up by 50% just in the last year. And that's of the people who have been caught. And as Dr. Chin indicated, AAPI Hate has said that over 3,000 of acts of violence against Asian Americans have been documented across the country. Just in New York City alone, where you have a large Asian population, New York City Police reports a 20-fold increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans, increased by 20 times. That's unthinkable.
Chief Diaz, much of the anti-Asian violence seems to occur almost on a random basis. Nevertheless, what steps have you taken to try to prevent it?
Yeah, and there's two things that I think are so important in order to prevent. Number one, when COVID hit, people really started working from home. They stopped getting out and just walking around the community. But one of the biggest prevention efforts is trying to get people out and interacting in their community. So if you look at the CID, as people are out, they're starting to do neighborhood walks where community members are actually coming together and providing their own safety group walks. We've been pushing for block watch, pieces where you can do more crime prevention and more engagement on trying to create preventative measures. We have been doing roll calls in the community. So specifically in the CID, in the Rainier Beach area, we've actually been getting all of our officers, instead of doing roll call in the precinct, we're actually doing the roll call in the community. And so we had officers actually interacting with the businesses, playing ping pong with some of the senior citizens. And so really it's trying to have that visible presence. When there is no visible presence, people will find the opportunity to commit crime. And so as much as we can get out and, we're still, within COVID, we're still experiencing some potential upticks in COVID, but as we can open up as a community and take those precautions, it's really important for us to be more visible presence to reduce that potential level of violence. And we always go into the mantra, if you see something, say something. And I think that's really the education component, to just make sure that we're messaging out. If you see something, report it. Even if you don't think it might rise to a level of crime, we will investigate it, because that person might not have done the crime specifically that time. But actually how we solved some of the high profile cases is we were able to link it to several other instances. And that has helped us through video evidence being able to have closure for some of the people impacted by it.
Dr. Hubbell, I'd like to add on to something that Chief Diaz had said, because I think I heard you mention when you asked the question, something about random acts. And the acts of violence against the AAPI communities are not random at all. They are specific. They are targeted against people who appear to be Asian. They have been targeted against those who are perceived to be the weakest, whether it's our elders or whether it's women. And they've been very specific. And I think about the incident in broad daylight that happened in the past few months with a young woman who was a Japanese teacher at a local school she was targeted in broad daylight and beaten. So these are not random. They're very, very specific. And as both Chief Diaz and Governor Locke have pointed out, they've been sanctioned by the rhetoric that has been coming from the highest elected office in this country. When you have such divisive language that is specifically designed to incite anger and to sanction violence again, and to point out Americans as not Americans, these acts almost become, the 45th president's words, perverted acts of patriotism, when they are exactly the opposite, and they are designed to exterminate and to keep people in the category of not human and not American.
Laurie, do you want to address the random, or do you?
Well, I just meant random in terms of hard to predict when it was going to occur, but I understand. Yeah.
That makes sense. Dr. Chin, when you and I spoke, you said you were one of the few AAPI women who decided to be outspoken about this issue. Why? What made you decide to be the one who's out there on that?
So, Joni, I have many conversations with other AAPI women throughout the Seattle community and nationally. And one of the reasons why I think it's very important for myself, for Governor Locke, for Chief Diaz, for everyone to speak out is because if you don't speak out, then there is no problem. If we are not naming that there are acts of violence, that there are hate crimes, then people will think that these are just muggings in New York City, that the attack and the beating of an Asian American elder in front of an apartment building where the security guards shut the door on her, to question whether or not that is a hate crime, questions whether or not there is hatred and whether or not there is racism there. And so I feel very compelled, both as the CEO of Treehouse and as a Chinese American woman and the granddaughter of immigrants, to name that there are these incidents that specifically target people who are part of my community. At Treehouse, 4% of the youth that we serve are Asian American Pacific Island descent. And when I think about the youth in our country and what could possibly happen to them, that when they are attacked or when they experience verbal violence, when they experience any kind of abuse, to question that it is real, or to question that they have the right to speak up, or that they have the right to be here when the hate speech is telling them that they do not, or is attacking their physiology as something that is abnormal. We have to speak out. And that's why it's very important to me to be able to say this. And when you look at the websites for AAPI hate and another website called hollaback.org, there's something called the 5 Ds. How do you address? How do you stand up? And how do you witness so that you can actually stop acts before they become violence? Or to Chief Diaz's point, how do you stop these incidents before they become crimes? And that is what we must do. We have to actively witness, which means name things that we see and not allow people to be disappeared into the background or people to be treated this way. It is not acceptable for anyone to visit acts of violence or abuse or racism on anyone else. And we have to speak up and say that.
Dr. Chin, how would you evaluate the response of both the state and local government and also the federal government so far in regards to this problem?
Dr. Hubbell, I appreciate that we now have a vice president who is a multiracial, highly educated woman who identifies both as Black and as Asian. And what she has done and what our current president have done with setting forward the federal agenda has been very heartening. I appreciate also Chief Diaz's and Mayor Durkin's commitment by saying that they are committed to the safety of our communities. And I also what concerns me, and that is very heartening, but what concerns me is that if it gets to the level of my needing to call Chief Diaz because there's an incident, then something has already happened. And what that means is that our citizenry is not educated well enough. Our citizenry is not, we are not taking care of each other appropriately. We are not calling out acts of violence. We are not protecting each other. We are not building strong communities. We're not teaching our children and teaching others that this is unacceptable behavior. We are not setting forward and abiding by rules of community that keep us all safe. And so while it is good that our federal and our state and our local governments are speaking up against incidents of AAPI hatred, it should not get to the point of us relying on law enforcement to stop these behaviors. It is incumbent on everyone that, as Chief Diaz has said, when you see something, you must say something, because if you do not, then you condone the act, especially if you were in the vicinity and you had a chance to deflect or to document or to distract. And those are some of the 5 Ds. So again, I appreciate what our government is doing, but it's up to us as individuals to educate and to stop these things as they happen.
Can I just jump in for 1 second? Governor Locke, you've been in government. How would you evaluate the response of state and local governments so far? Do you see some things they might do differently?
Well, I think that asking police departments to intervene and having local governments intervene, as Dr. Chin was indicating, is too late. I mean, it's great that the Congress has passed hate crime legislation focusing on the violence against AAPIs, and that the Justice Department will be collecting the information, compiling the statistics, and able to intervene. They already have that authority. And it's great that the prosecutor's office is prosecuting more cases in King County. But again, words matter. And so we need what we need from our elected officials and from all leaders, whether nonprofit, religious, faith-based, to corporate leaders and to government leaders, is turning this mindset around that hate crimes is acceptable, whether it's against Black, yellow, brown, whatever, that discrimination is, and scapegoating and racial profiling, systemic racism is unacceptable. And it really starts with the top. It really starts with the top. And so for the president, for President Trump to say that after the protest and the violence in Charlottesville, that, well, there are good people on both sides. I mean, minimizing that division, exacerbating, encouraging that division and hatred, that's the problem. And that's why I commend President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris and so many other leaders in standing up and saying, no, we need to embrace the diversity of our country. And I think that's what we really need to focus on, getting back to the basics, letting people understand that except for the Native Americans, I mean, we started this panel with a land acknowledgement, but let's remember, except for the Native Americans, the indigenous people of America, the rest of us are all foreigners. We're all foreigners, whether we're first generation, 10th generation, whether our ancestors came on the Mayflower on a slave vessel from Africa or a steamer from Asia. We're all foreigners. And it's that diversity of people, of different cultures, different religions, different ideas and music and food and perspectives and experiences. That's what really makes America great. I mean, when Trump says, make America great again, well, he should focus on celebrating the diversity of this country instead of tearing people apart and pitting people against each other.
And I'd like to add in there, and I think Dr. Chin and both Governor Locke are extremely right. They're right on. And by the time it gets to police, it's already, already past its what the issue is. This is a learned, like, no baby comes in hating. No baby comes in with violence on their mind. This is something that is a learned experience. So if we teach our young to learn to hate, if we teach our young to be violent, like, that is what they're going to do in the community. And so, we've got to start embracing our community, those that are less fortunate and those that don't have the resources and tools, be able to help those so they don't learn and teach hate. And I think, it's the responsibility of every parent, it's the responsibility of every community member to embrace those and making sure that those are not the ideals of America. And I think it to me, for me, at least one of my biggest responsibilities is making sure that I teach my kids in the right way. And, just like my parents taught me. And so, yeah, I think once it gets to us, this has been, a decade or a couple decades of learned behavior that is not appropriate. And we've got to address that.
Larry?
Joni, I'll pass it on to you.
Okay, Chief Diaz, let's stay with you for a second. It's also fair to say in some of these stories I've been reading that anti-Black hate acts have increased more recently, doubling if I'm not mistaken. Why, at least in Seattle, and maybe it's the pandemic, maybe it's the rhetoric, but why in Seattle is that also happening?
I think we've seen all elements of hate when it comes to race, ethnicity, and ancestry has risen. But when you look at the type of violence that our Black community has felt, and even in conjunction with law enforcement, it raises a lot of awareness and questions. And I think people are starting to ask questions about how law enforcement should have interaction with police or with community members. And I think that's more evolving and changing. And I think that there are people in our community that, have, greatly, well, and I think to the history of it, they've benefited from keeping, Black people down. And so, I think that this is one product, a byproduct of that hate that has kept, our Black community down. And so, where we see bias incidences and where we see bias crime, and we think that we're progressive and that we have, like, as a city, we have these progressive views and values, but that's not everybody in the city. And we've got to make sure that we as a city embrace all aspects of that and that we are doing the right thing and we hold all of our community accountable. And that's where, sometimes when you have racist acts against the Black community, that, where police can be a product of accountability, that not the sole level of accountability, but be a product of it.
Governor Locke, for years, the United States has been a leader in terms of promoting human rights. Unfortunately, in the last 4 years, we lost that leadership role. As a former ambassador, how would you respond to the Chinese government's criticism of anti-Asian bias in the United States?
Well, I think that obviously with the world seeing the murder of George Floyd, exposing the fact that America does have problems, lowered people's esteem for America. But what I say to people from around the world is that at least we in America are able to acknowledge our mistakes, our errors, our history, and that we strive to do better. And that's in stark contrast to so many other countries around the world who ignore their problems, where women are not even, are basically prohibited from assuming high positions in government, to ethnic minorities in many other countries, even being allowed to operate businesses, or to be involved in even local politics. So yes, we have faults, but at least we acknowledge those faults, and we're always striving to learn from our mistakes and our errors and our transgressions, and we're trying to do better. I mean, I always mention to people from around the world that why is it that during World War II you had Japanese Americans volunteering to form some of the most decorated military unit in U.S. history, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, while their parents and aunts and uncles and sisters were living in the United States behind barbed wire concentration camps, armed with, guarded by soldiers with machine guns. Why is it that you had units like the Tuskegee Airmen, African-American unit, even though they came from cities and communities with rampant segregation and, could only ride in the back of the bus, or drinking fountains or counters at restaurants that were Black only and white only, or Native Americans who came from reservations, which were just rampant with poverty. I mean, abject poverty. And the list goes on and on. Why is it that they volunteered to serve for a government that subjected their own people for decades, if not centuries, to racism, discrimination, and poverty? Because they believed in the ultimate future of America. They believed in the promise of America, of a better, more perfect union. And that's what distinguishes, I think, America from all these other countries, that yes, we have our faults, but we strive, we recognize them, we admit it, we're open about it, and we strive to do better.
I'd like to direct this question to both Governor Locke and Dr. Chin. How much do you believe Trump and his allies merely tapped into an anti-Asian racism rather than actually originating it?
Rather than what?
Rather than actually originating it. How much did they, in fact, tap into something that was already there?
Well, I think there's always been an element within people's souls to always find fault and blame for our problems, and to find fault with other people. Back in the 70s and 80s, when the Japanese automakers were really coming on strong, and people were afraid that Detroit would lose their jobs. You had the famous case of Vincent Chin, who was murdered by some Detroit auto workers, thinking that he was Japanese, when in fact he was Chinese. Again, Asian Americans, they all look the same, and there is that profiling. And look at the backlash against Hispanics and Latinos because of the outsourcing of jobs to Mexico. And then, of course, the same thing against Asian Americans with the outsourcing to China and other parts of the world. So, I mean, there is this latency of discrimination, of scapegoating for the ills of our society. You're seeing that in Europe as well, with all the backlash against immigrants and refugees, especially in a tough economy. But the question is whether or not people are encouraging it and bringing that to the fore. And so I really fault many of our political leaders, Democrats and Republicans, but especially our past president, for really almost inciting that division.
Is that the mechanism you're saying? In other words, we were supposed to be post-racial at the end of Obama's second term, but then here comes Trump and he makes everybody just like let it all hang out or something like that. It's in there and you get to strut it if you want to? Is that how it works?
And when people strut it, as Chief Diaz was indicating, it becomes learned. It becomes acceptable. It becomes an encouragement for others to engage in that behavior. It emboldens people to commit acts of violence against women and elderly Asian Americans. And it encourages people to come out and protest the Black Lives Matter movement, and to say this is now acceptable. It's almost a cascading effect, which is why, as Dr. Chin said, we need to speak out against it. We need to speak out because, race it's like a cancer or a virus itself. Left unchecked, it spreads. It gets more deeply embedded in people's psyche and their hearts within our culture. So anytime there's racism and discrimination and profiling going on, all of us have a duty to speak out against it, whether it's the violence against George Floyd to the rhetoric of any president or politician.
Thank you, Dr. Hubbell. As Governor Locke pointed out earlier, there's a long history of anti-immigration laws, of institutionalized racism, and he's just pointed out the tip of it. The 45th president did not create this. what he did was take advantage of it to build divisions amongst people and to really sanction from the highest elected office in this country that there are people who do not deserve justice, that there are people that there is a clear division in society. Some people are American, some people are not. Some people have the right to be here and some people don't. I mean, Joni mentioned post-racial. The concept of post-racialism is an intellectual conceit. You ask any person of color, I grew up experiencing racism, experiencing racial slurs. I am sure that is true for Governor Locke. I am sure that is true for Chief Diaz. That is true for any person of color who is living in a majority white neighborhood or who grew up that way. Any person who's gone through our education system has also seen that some of the materials that are still being used in school districts today contain questions that question the slant of Asian eyes or introduce hate speech in the form of history lessons about immigration or about different countries. We have never been post-racial. People like to say that because we had a president who was non-white, and that was truly groundbreaking, but that was just it was a very important data point, but it did not change the racial incidences and the institutionalized racism that exists in this country. So there is a lot of work to be done, and we can only start to do it when we have discussions like this and we have an opportunity to question the things that, again, as Chief Diaz pointed out, that our children are being taught, or the systems that they are learning these behaviors in.
In the title of this conversation, we talked about, we included the idea that we're going to have some solutions to this.
Exactly.
So we would move on to solutions right now. So Joni, would you like to start?
Well, so Dr. Chin, you're out in the community, and what do you think? And you also mentioned we got to do something about this. What are the best steps in your mind to make Asian American and Pacific Islander residents feel stronger and able to protect themselves?
Well, Joni, there was a heartening story about an Asian elder who was attacked, I believe it was in San Francisco, who ended up picking up a 2x4 and sending her to the hospital. She was not a victim. You know, what happened to her was horrific. She sustained physical injury, but what she did was she did not allow herself to be a victim, just take it from her attacker. So the things that we need to do as bystanders and upstanders is to actually not just witness and say, oh my goodness, I see this, I'm going to say something. But again, on the AAPI hate.org site and also on the hollaback.org site, there's something called the 5 Ds that anybody can do that will lead to us not having to call Chief Diaz and our policemen, that we can do things like distract. So if I was walking to have tea with Governor Locke and I saw something happening to Dr. Lee, the first thing I could do is talk to Dr. Lee to distract and say, Dr. Lee, are you okay? How are you doing? But to actually do something. So you distract, you can direct if it's safe, which is assessing the situation, speaking up and saying, excuse me, that's not acceptable what you're doing to Dr. Lee. I see what you're doing and that's not acceptable. You can delegate, you can get help. That's when you call other people in who are around you. After this happens, you document, you provide a record so that there is evidence for, there's stuff that you can tell to Chief Diaz. You can also delay what you were doing and check in with a person who has been experiencing this. But this is all part of what we can do. And it may sound small, but I promise you it is very significant, because when I've been walking down the streets of the ID, that I have had things said to me. When I've coughed in public at the onset of this virus, there have been people crossing the street. There have been people saying things, muttering curses under their breath, muttering things about COVID virus. And I can't tell you how belittling that feels, how demeaning, and how much it can make you feel afraid. And when there are other people there and they are witnessing this, we cannot let this happen, because it could be anybody. We are a majority Asian minority area. We're 21% Asian American here. And we We need to wrap around each other and not allow these things to happen.
Chief Diaz, we understand that you believe that the police department is not staffed enough to handle this matter. If you were fully staffed, how could you more effectively address this problem?
You know, there's really a couple of different ways that we would focus on. Number one, I actually bring in our community service officers. They've been doing a lot. They're actually not sworn officers or civilians that do a lot of follow-up work for our department. And they can be a very useful tool, because when an officer is going from 911 call to 911 call, you know, you don't get that follow-up, that warm handoff to sometimes services or connection to resources. And so the CSOs is one component to help learn and educate and work with community. We also have crime prevention coordinators that crime prevention coordinators are trying to identify sometimes environmental factors that can reduce potential areas of violence, like, you know, increasing lighting and finding, you know, businesses to open up and not have so much display that they can't see out of the windows and actually see and observe things. To Dr. Chin's point of making sure that, you know, people are actually educated enough to know some of these 5Ds, you know, and being able to direct and, you know, and even just deflect some of the issues that are going on. And then you have the officers that also play a role in being able to respond to the actual incidences. I was down after the couple that was assaulted in the CID about 2 months ago. We made an arrest in that case. And then shortly, like the next day, we had an incident where somebody pulled a gun and shot a round off at somebody. And we had a number of officers respond. And that's the violence that I need, you know, that the officers are needing to respond to. We were able to take that person into custody. And, you know, that's where that's the amount of officers that I need to actually make sure that the community is safe as well. So there's several different components. There's, you know, community that, you know, plays a role. There's, you know, some of our civilian type positions that can play a role in the prevention and in the follow-up. And then there's the officers that are also out being a visible presence to also be a deterrent as well.
Governor Locke, I'd like to you address sort of the big picture here. What do you think are the wisest steps that we as a society and government can take to try to combat this awful trend?
Well, it's going back to the notion of it's learned. And we need more people speaking up, talking about the fabric of America, that we are all people, one way or another, from many different countries, different nationalities, different ethnic groups, different cultures, whether you're Irish, Polish, French, German, Japanese, Chinese ancestry, Southeast Asian, African, Latin American, I mean, Hispanic. I mean, we need to celebrate that diversity and let people know that, you know, nobody is a foreigner. No one is an unacceptable group within the United States of America.
Chief Diaz, a group in San Francisco is called We Come Together. And it's just kind of low tech, this idea that they're doing. They're trying to keep Asian elders safe in the community by providing them with whistles. I mean, really loud whistles. Is that a good idea for Seattle? Is that even going on here already?
Yeah, actually, we have a local group of people that got together, and they're starting to do community walks. They actually have whistles that they're also using to acknowledge what's going on if there's maybe a specific issue. And it's really, it's when they have the groups in numbers. So if you have 5 or 6 people that are walking the neighborhood, they become a deterrent for, you know, potential crime issues to occur. But yeah, we are actually using that same model, and it's not by the police department, but in this community members actually, you know, spearheading it. And I think that that is so powerful because it's community driven, and it's really what is needed to help keep people safe. Dr.
Chin, what does that sound like to you? Does that sound like that would work? That would make people feel safe?
I think it's one part, Joni. I think that actually helps, because often when you're in a dangerous situation and you know that something is about to happen, having that whistle, it really gets people's attention. But again, it's just one step, and it's really that helps in the moment when something is about to happen. But what we really need to do is focus on the level of systems change, and that's where education happens, is when we can actually change what people's expectations are, change what our children are being taught, and change the expectations of behavior. So a whistle will help in this moment, because hate crimes are at an epidemic, and that will help, but it's not going to solve anything until we actually start to address the root causes of this behavior.
And as others have mentioned, it goes back to even our textbooks, and really, exposing and teaching our young kids to the truth about the founding of this country, the basis of this country in terms of racism and oppression and economic oppression, as well as all the events going up through the late 1800s to even the 1940s. So many of the history books don't even mention the incarceration of the Japanese during World War II, don't even talk about the Asian Exclusion Act, or the alien land laws. And a lot of that actually was started, that national movement to prohibit Asian Americans from owning land, which was adopted by individual states, mostly the West Coast, but even in parts of Central or the Midwest, really originated here in the Seattle area. Now we think of ourselves as so.
Why do you think that is? What was the reason it originated in Seattle?
Well, it originated in terms of trying to make sure that trying to take away land from some of the Japanese farmers who were farming areas that were really not all that. I mean, they were swamps and they were filled with trees. And so the Japanese settlers that were here started clearing the land and building these strawberry farms and things like that, and produce farms. And some white settlers and others were getting envious and really afraid that, okay, they're taking away, they've developed some really good land that they would like, but also a fear that the influx of Asian immigrants was going to take away jobs from the white residents of the Puget Sound area. So it was all economically based. And that racism in terms of the prejudice against Hispanics, all about jobs. It's all about jobs, or even African Americans. They're taking away jobs.
We have a question from one of our members of our audience, and that person is directing this to Chief Diaz. What are the characteristics and background of the people who are attacking AAPI?
I think that they come from a variety of different backgrounds. I mean, I don't think that there's any one specific background, and I think speaking to what we've been talking about earlier, violence and hate are learned experience. They're learned, and so it doesn't matter what race. It doesn't matter if it. And I think we predominantly see it in the white community. The level of power, trying to sometimes keep that level of structure or governmental structures or power. But I do think that it does cross all races. And that is the struggle that we have. I don't think that there's any, like you could say, a person 20 to 25, a white male, and having like some descriptors. I think it varies through all ages and races.
So we are turning over this part of the question and answer section to Dr. Yutan Lee and our Seattle University students. Dr. Lee, as we said, is the director of the Asian Studies program at Seattle U. I'm turning off my camera to make sure the little Zoom boxes stay a little bigger, and staying with you on audio because this is a great conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joni. We have two students with us today, Jeffrey Cook, who is a rising senior in Asian Studies, and Matthew Condi, who is a sophomore in journalism. Matthew is in the process of leading an effort to set up a student club for the AAPI community on the Seattle University campus. They will each ask you some questions, but I will start with a question of my own for Governor Locke. The recent violence against the AAPI community in the United States is seen by many countries as a sign of the decline of American supremacy and the American democratic system not working. I am quoting former Ambassador Chas Freeman's recent remark. I quote, recent polling shows that most of the world now sees our political system as broken, our governance as incompetent, our economy and racial inequalities as perniciously debilitating, end quote. China in particular has played up this message. Given your role as the former ambassador to China, and the two countries are getting very close to naming new ambassadors to each other, what message do you have for the new ambassador to China regarding how the AAPI community or how the ambassador could use the AAPI issue in a positive way to help with improving US-China relations?
Well, I think U.S.-China relations are much more complex and focused on so many other issues than what's happening to the AAPI community here in America. But certainly a lot of people in China are looking at the acts of violence, not just against AAPIs, but against all ethnic groups, starting with the blatant murder and killing of George Floyd. That was seen by the entire world. And then, of course, the January 6 riots and occupation of the U.S. Capitol, to even a U.S. president saying that the election was stolen. So it has really, I think, diminished the stature of America and really makes it much harder for America to urge the rest of the world to respect elections, to have peaceful transfers of power, and to embrace the diversity of their own populations when the rest of the world sees us. But I think that despite our flaws, that next U.S. ambassador should point out the fact that we have the Congress responding with new legislation. We have governors, Democrats and Republicans, speaking out against the violence and the hatred toward Asian Americans. And that even though that we have our challenges, don't count America out, that in times of crises, we've always been able to come together, and that we are still the country of innovation. And that innovation is because of that diversity of people, that so many of the scientists and the researchers that developed these vaccines that are now saving not only America, but around the world, were scientists of color, of people of color. And that, look, I mean, nobody ever thought, I mean, most of the world doubted that a vaccine could be developed in such a short period of time. Most people said it's going to take 3 or 4 years. And yet, thanks to the ingenuity and the commitment of the American government, working with the private sector and researchers and universities from around the country, and in fact around the world, we were able to develop a vaccine in such record time. So yes, America has its flaws. That's what the U.S. ambassador needs to acknowledge, but that we always try to overcome and address and correct those flaws and learn from our flaws.
Thank you, Ambassador Locke. I now turn the mic to Jeffrey.
Hi, panel. This is a question I had prepared initially thinking of Dr. Chin, but I think it might be appropriate for everyone on the panel to address or speak on. I was curious if you could identify maybe some AAPI-focused organizations active in our community here in Seattle or Washington that we could support or reach out to in this time of especially great need. I know a lot of organizations in Chinatown and the International District have suspended a lot of the normal events due to the pandemic. So I was just curious if you had more resources for people who are looking to make a contribution or add their voice.
Jeffrey, I love that question. Thank you for asking that. There are so many organizations that both serve Asian American specific populations and also are incredible coalition building community members that are dedicated to partnering with other organizations to provide a safety net within our region. There are larger ones like Asian Counseling and Referral Services that provides counseling and all kinds of community services, including food banks in over 50 different languages. They've been here for decades. That is one. For people who are curious, there is an organization called the Asian Pacific Directors Coalition that many Asian American CEOs and executive directors belong to. So they can, on that website is a much more comprehensive list. If you look at all the member organizations there, you'll see that there are so many, too many to even name. There's the International Community Health Services. There's Kinon, which is Chinese, low-income Chinese housing. There is Seattle Cato. There's Nikkei Concerns. Governor Locke, I'm sure that you and Chief Diaz, the list is huge and long, and we could, be more than happy to provide a written list of organizations for you to distribute later. But Governor Locke, Chief Diaz, I'm sure.
Well, Dr. Chin has really listed so many of them. I think it's just easier to just go onto the website and look up Asian American organizations in Seattle. We have organizations focused on Southeast Asian refugees, Japanese American Citizen League, one of the premier oldest civil rights organizations on behalf of originally Japanese Americans, but really all Asian Americans. You have organizations like the OCA, which started off being an organization for Chinese Americans, which has then become pandemic and focusing on all AAPIs. And of course, let's not forget organizations like the NAACP, the Urban League, El Centro, which are focused on issues and needs and concerns of African Americans and as well as the Latino community. And the list goes on to even the ACLU. So, there's so many different organizations, and anybody who has an interest in any particular aspect should really focus on those types of community organizations that are closer to them geographically or closer in terms of their interests, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's housing, whether it's just wraparound services.
I couldn't agree more. I think they answered that question. So,
great. Matthew, would you like to ask a question, please?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lee, and also thank you, panelists, as well for your insights and for this discussion. I believe that discussing the issue of anti-AAPI racism is the first step towards solving this issue. But despite conversations both in this town hall and throughout this nation, there has been little legislative action in addressing anti-AAPI hatred. And I was wondering, why has there been no direct governmental action or answer to anti-AAPI racism? And at this point, does change lie within the actions of the government or within that of families and individual people? This is more like a general question, so yes.
Well, I think you have to recognize that all governments, unfortunately, are slow to respond. And whether it's policies, tougher penalties, collection of data, and designating units within the Justice Department or a police department to create, anti-hate units and things like that. Governments are always slow to respond. And that's why it's so important that communities take action on their own and unite and form alliances with other civil rights and social justice groups, which is why it was so great that the NAACP and anti-Asian organizations, anti-Asian hate organizations formed together, and the ACLU and so many other, and JACL and so many Asian organizations all formed together. So you should not always rely on government. Communities have to take things into their own hands, whether it's the distribution of these whistles and so forth, or as Lisa Chin was talking about, the 5 Ds. We need to band together and act on our own. Government sometimes can serve as a catalyst. Sometimes they simply come up with policies that reflect the consensus of the community. But you should not always depend on government.
Well, and I agree with what Governor Locke has said. There has been some recent action, and I totally agree that government's really slow. But in March, Seattle Mayor Durkin, along with City Council President Gonzalez and Council Member Mosqueda, were pushing the City of Seattle to devote $1.5 million towards stopping anti-Asian hate crimes, and that funding would go to community centers, mental health support, Asian American-owned small businesses, youth-led anti-racism projects, and safety training. So that's a promising start. King County Executive Dal Constantine announced his plans to fight anti-Asian racism with money from the American Rescue Plan from the federal government. That's the pandemic relief legislation that granted billions of federal dollars to Washington State, including $437 million to King County. That first part of the funding, according to the county executive, would be $5 million for community-based organizations, including multicultural media and a coalition of 8 organizations that are battling hate and bias. And then on the federal level, there are a number of initiatives that Merrick Garland has announced. The White House released a statement on March 30th that has reinstated the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and it's going to have its initial focus on anti-Asian bias and violence. There is more funding coming from the Department of Health and Human Services, allocating almost $50 million from the American Rescue Plan to a new grant program that will be aimed at AAPI survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. There's a COVID-19 equity task force. So there are, well, I completely appreciate, Matthew, the frustration of, we have seen people attacked, we've seen people murdered, we've seen the violence and the death that hate crimes and hate speech can bring. So how come our elected officials and our governmental systems are not doing more? They're starting to, and that is far more than the previous administration ever did. So I have hope, but I'm also very, very impatient, as I'm hearing you are too.
And, I think to answer this question, we still, up until about 2 years ago, we had 5 states that didn't have any hate crimes on their books. Now in 2021, I think we're down to 1 or 2 states that don't have any hate crime on the books, but so we don't even require some states to actually collect data. And I actually am one of the co-chairs for the Human and Civil Rights Committee for the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And we were looking at different states, and one state had never had a prosecution under a hate crime law. Even though they might have had the hate crime actually on the books, they didn't collect any data to associate whether there was actually prosecution in these cases. So we have a lot to work on in this country. And I do think that there are things that the community can do, exactly to what Governor Locke and Dr. Chin were noting. But we also have to advocate as well. We have to make sure that we push for stronger legislation at times, and push for good data collection of making sure that we know that these things are actually being prosecuted and there's accountability components in that. And then also, I think, at the federal level, there is the legislation that is starting to come about, but I think Governor's right on when it says that sometimes our governmental agencies are slow to react. I think we just got to hold accountable our systems.
Dr. Lee, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, well, I have a follow-up question. Governor Locke pointed out that government actions can be slow at times in terms of making legislative changes. I have a question from a political science major, Zach Andrews. His question is, he understands that there has been a long history of xenophobia, Asian phobia, xenophobia in the United States, and including the Pacific coast. His question is, what role related to the lack of quick action on the part of the government? His question is, what role has the media played, or what role can the media play in terms of helping making awareness of API related crimes and helping the country to make legislative changes to solve this problem?
Well, obviously, the media plays a very important role because we need to get the stories out. We need to get the facts out. And if the public is not aware of the extent and how widespread these acts of violence are, the over 3,000 cases as documented by, AAPI hate, to even the police department statistics and the prosecution statistics, if the public is not aware, then they can't even demand action or support action by governments or by police departments. So a strong, free media is so important, which is why it's so distressing that we have so many newspapers that are folding up and ending. And that whatever newspapers we have, they hardly cover anything at all these days. And then you rely on social media, and there's so much inaccuracy in some of our social media platforms as well. So a strong, vibrant, free press, radio stations, television stations, newspapers is really critical.
And as Governor Locke points out, the critical role that the media plays it's not just in reporting the news. It's also in depicting what is acceptable in our culture. Who do we see represented to ourselves? 20 years ago, you could count on one hand the number of programs that had non-white stars in them on primetime television. And now when you look around, you're seeing that even the entertainment industry is showing that it has a far way to go with just in time and with all the different movements that are there, and Oscars so white. So it's not just the reporting of the news and deeming what is newsworthy and therefore turning facts into knowledge. It's also who do we look to? Can we see ourselves reflected in the mainstream, which would sanction that we are Americans, no matter what our physiology is, or no matter what you believe my ancestors came from? Can I see myself on television, in social media, represented all around us? And when that starts to happen, then we have a chance of reducing hateful acts and reducing hate speech.
Thank you very much, panelists. Back to you, Dr. Hubbell.
Yes, thank you, each of you, for coming. Chief Adrian, Diaz, Dr. Lisa Chin, and also Governor Gary Locke. I think, we've done 21 of these panels. This is one of the best ones we've done. And I think not only because the answers were just, so excellent, but also nobody ducked any questions, which occasionally happens. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Town Hall. And I just want to tell everybody that we're going to do this again next year. We're hoping maybe the fall quarter, during the fall session, we might have it remote. We would like to have it in person. But certainly we're hoping that in the winter and also in the spring, it'll probably be held in Piggott. We haven't come up with a agenda yet, but we guarantee you that we're going to get some excellent panelists and to continue this tradition. So thank you very much, panelists, for coming. Thank you, students. Thank you, Dr. Lee.